11 Japanese Zeros, diving in perfect formation. One American fighter, alone at 22,000 feet with nothing but altitude, ammunition, and a notebook full of trigonometry equations his squadron mates called useless scribbling. The radio crackled with panic as the enemy formation split into 3 attack groups, each one angling for a different vector of death. What happened in the next 4 minutes wasn't luck. It wasn't instinct. It wasn't even courage. It was mathematics, pure, merciless, and more deadly than any machine gun ever mounted in a fighter plane. The pilot they'd nicknamed Slide Rule was about to prove that angles don't lie, physics doesn't panic, and sometimes the deadliest weapon in a cockpit is a mind that thinks 3 moves ahead while everyone else is still reacting to the first. The sky above the Solomon Sea belongs to whoever can calculate faster than they can die. American bomber formations bleed altitude and cruise daily over this stretch of hostile water. Japanese interceptors rise from hidden airfields like vengeful spirits, their Mitsubishi A6 M0s dancing through the air with lethal grace. The P-38 Lightning was designed to escort bombers through this gauntlet, but design only matters if the pilot knows how to use both engines, both guns, and both hemispheres of his brain. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Most fighter pilots fly on instinct. They trust their reflexes, the feel of the stick, the primitive calculus of speed and position that keeps them breathing. They learn by watching, by surviving, by counting bullet holes after each mission. The best among them have animal cunning, a sixth sense for closure rates and deflection angles. They don't calculate, they react. Then there was Second Lieutenant Thomas Chun. He flew differently. He thought differently. And for that, his squadron mates called him everything from professor to slide rule to the human computer. None of it was meant as a compliment. Chun was 24 years old, compact and wiry, with thick glasses that fogged constantly in the tropical humidity. He carried a leather-bound notebook everywhere, to the mess tent, the flight line, even tucked inside his flight suit during pre-mission briefings. The other pilots noticed. They joked about it. They asked what he was always writing. Equations, he'd say. Angle calculations. They'd shake their heads and walk away. His squadron, the 475th Fighter Group's 431st Fighter Squadron, operated from Henderson Field on Guadalcanal. The base was a collection of Quonset huts, coral runways, and the constant whine of twin Allison engines. Every dawn, ground crews pulled canvas covers off the Lightnings and prepped them for another day of long-range escort duty. Every sunset, they counted how many came back. Chun's crew chief, Sergeant Mike Kowalski from Detroit, liked him despite the eccentricity. Chun asked real questions, not about kill markings or mess hall schedules, but about ammunition ballistics, convergence patterns, and the precise muzzle velocity of the 20mm cannon at different altitudes. Kowalski answered them all. The other pilots didn't ask those questions. They wanted their planes ready, their guns loaded, their fuel tanks full. They wanted to get airborne, complete the mission, and get back alive. But Chun wanted to understand the mathematics of survival. Before every mission, he calculated. He worked out ballistic trajectories for different ranges and deflection angles. He mapped convergence zones for the 4.50 caliber machine guns and single 20mm cannon mounted in the Lightning's nose. He studied Japanese tactics, not from intelligence briefings, but from gun camera footage he borrowed from the photo lab. He analyzed it frame by frame, measuring angles, timing maneuvers, calculating the geometry of death. His squadron mates watched this ritual and shook their heads. Captain Mike Bargo, a veteran with 7 kills, told him bluntly that math wouldn't help when a Zero was firing at him from 200 yards. Another pilot laughed and said if he wanted to calculate, he should have joined the engineers. A third suggested that he was overthinking his way to an early grave. Chun didn't argue. He just nodded politely and kept calculating. Because he'd seen something in the gun camera footage, a pattern in how Japanese pilots attacked, a predictable geometry in the way they positioned themselves for killing shots. And he suspected there was a way to turn that predictability into a mathematical trap. He just needed to test it at 300 miles per hour with tracer rounds burning past his canopy. Thomas Chun grew up in San Francisco's Chinatown. His father operated a small importing business. His mother taught mathematics at the local high school. They raised him in a narrow apartment above Grant Avenue where the smell of jasmine tea mixed with diesel exhaust from the trolleys below. He learned calculus before he could legally drive. By age 16, he was auditing engineering courses at UC Berkeley. He didn't play sports or chase girls. He built radio sets and slide rules from scratch. When he graduated high school in 1939, he wanted to study aeronautical engineering. His parents supported the plan until Pearl Harbor changed everything. Chen enlisted in the Army Air Forces in February 1942, not out of patriotism or adventure-seeking, but because it was the only way he'd ever get near a fighter plane. The recruiter asked if he wanted to be a pilot or a navigator. Chen said pilot. The recruiter looked at his slight build and thick glasses, then shrugged and handed him the forms. Primary flight training was in Arizona. The heat was crushing. The instructors were former airline pilots with no patience for hesitation or overthinking. Chen struggled initially. His hands were too tense on the controls. His reactions too measured. But he listened, practiced, and gradually improved. Advanced training was in California, where he first flew a P-38. The Lightning was unlike anything he'd experienced. Twin engines, counter-rotating propellers, tricycle landing gear, and concentrated firepower that could tear a fighter to pieces in seconds. It was also complex, unforgiving, and prone to killing inexperienced pilots who didn't respect its quirks. Chen respected everything about it. He memorized the pilot's manual. He studied the ballistics tables. He calculated power settings for different altitudes and airspeeds. His instructors noted that he was methodical to the point of obsession, but his check rides were perfect. He graduated in the middle of his class, not the best stick and rudder man, but the most precise. They assigned him to the 475th Fighter Group and shipped him to the Pacific in August 1943. He arrived at Henderson Field during the height of the Solomon Islands campaign. The base was hot, humid, and smelled like aviation fuel mixed with rotting vegetation. His bunk was in a Quonset hut with 7 other pilots. They played poker at night, drank warm beer, and told stories about girls back home. Chen mostly read technical manuals and worked in his notebook. When asked what he was writing, Chen explained he was developing a firing solution system. The idea was to pre-calculate deflection angles for various attack scenarios, creating a kind of mental lookup table that would eliminate guesswork in combat. Instead of estimating where to aim, he could apply precise mathematical formulas. His squadron mates found this amusing. One pilot said you couldn't think your way through a dogfight. Another said combat was about instinct, not equations. A third laughed and suggested Chen would be calculating while a Zero put cannon shells through his cockpit. Chen didn't argue. He just kept working. Because what he was developing wasn't just firing solutions. It was a complete mathematical model of aerial combat, treating airplanes as ballistic objects moving through three-dimensional space according to predictable physical laws. If you knew the variables, range, closure rate, target aspect angle, ammunition ballistics, you could predict where to aim with slide rule precision. The challenge was performing these calculations in seconds while pulling G-forces and dodging tracer fire. Chen's solution was to pre-compute everything. He created tables showing deflection angles for targets at different ranges and aspect angles. He memorized muzzle velocities and time of flight data for his ammunition. He practiced mental arithmetic until he could calculate firing solutions faster than most pilots could blink. It was all theoretical. He hadn't tested it in combat yet, but he believed the mathematics were sound. The autumn of 1943 was a killing season over the Pacific. Japanese air power was still formidable despite mounting losses. Experienced pilots flew Zeros with devastating efficiency, exploiting every weakness in American tactics. They knew the Lightning's vulnerabilities, its size, its predictable attack patterns, the way American pilots tended to dive away when outnumbered. American fighter doctrine emphasized aggression. Close with the enemy and destroy him. The P-38's advantages were speed, firepower, and altitude performance. But those advantages only mattered if you could bring them to bear effectively. Too many Lightning pilots died trying to turn fight with Zeros, or diving away at angles that gave Japanese pilots clean deflection shots. Chen watched these patterns develop. He studied after-action reports. He analyzed gun camera footage frame by frame. He noticed that most unsuccessful engagements followed predictable sequences. American fighters would spot enemy aircraft, dive to attack, then find themselves outnumbered and outmaneuvered in horizontal turning fights. The problem wasn't courage or skill, it was geometry. American pilots were fighting in 3 dimensions, but thinking in 2. They focused on immediate threats without calculating how their maneuvers affected the overall tactical picture. Chen began developing what he called sequential engagement theory. Instead of treating a dogfight as chaos, he approached it as a series of mathematical problems that could be solved in sequence. Each enemy aircraft represented a ballistic equation. Each maneuver created new geometric relationships. If you could calculate faster than the situation changed, you could stay ahead of the chaos. He mentioned this concept carefully during a squadron briefing. He suggested that mathematical analysis might improve combat effectiveness. Major Frank Nichols, the squadron operations officer, listened politely. Then he reminded Chun that combat wasn't a classroom exercise. It was about killing the enemy before he killed you. Chun understood, but he quietly continued developing his system, because the alternative was watching good men die in preventable ways. October 15, 1943. The mission was a bomber escort to Rabaul, 230 miles of open water, then 50 miles over heavily defended enemy territory. Intelligence reported at least 40 Japanese fighters stationed at various airfields around the target. The 475th would provide close escort for A-Team-B, 25 Mitchell bombers attacking the harbor installations. Chen flew as element leader in a 4-ship formation. His wingman was 2nd Lieutenant Bobby Martinez from El Paso, a natural pilot but prone to aggressive maneuvering. The other 2 Lightnings were flown by experienced veterans, Captain Jim Wade and Lieutenant Frank Torres. They climbed to 28,000 feet and throttled back to conserve fuel. The bombers flew in tight formation below them, aluminum shapes trailing white contrails against the blue Pacific. The radio chatter was minimal, just routine position reports and fuel checks. Chen ran through his mental calculations. Fuel consumption at current power settings gave them approximately 90 minutes of combat time. Ammunition load was standard, 500 rounds per .50 caliber gun, 150 rounds for the 20mm cannon. Convergence pattern was set for 250 yards, optimal for most engagement scenarios he'd calculated. The Japanese interceptors came up from Rabaul like angry hornets. Chen saw them first, 11 contacts climbing rapidly from the southwest. A mixed formation of A-6 M0s and what looked like 2 Kawasaki Ki-61 Tony fighters. They were positioned perfectly to intercept the bomber stream from multiple angles. He called them out. Wade acknowledged and began a gentle turn to intercept. But Chen was already calculating. 11 enemies, for friendlies. The Japanese formation was spreading into 3 groups. 4 Zeros heading for the bombers, 4 more climbing to engage the escorts, and 3, including the Tonys, positioning for a high-side attack. Classic Japanese tactics. Split the escort force, then overwhelm the bombers with multiple simultaneous attacks. Chen made a decision that would have gotten him court-martialed if it hadn't worked so perfectly. He broke formation. Instead of following Wade toward the lower group of Zeros, Chen pulled hard left and climbed toward the high group. Martinez followed, confused but disciplined. Wade's radio call was sharp. Chen, maintain formation. Chen ignored it. He was calculating intercept angles, closure rates, and firing solutions. The high group of Zeros was in a loose line abreast formation, climbing at approximately 2,500 feet per minute. Their closure rate with his Lightning was roughly 600 miles per hour combined speed. Time to intercept, 43 seconds. He adjusted his climb angle slightly, trading some rate of climb for increased airspeed. The geometry was critical. He needed to meet them at the exact moment when their formation was most vulnerable, when they were focused on positioning for their own attack and not expecting a head-on assault from above. 30 seconds. The Zeros were clearly visible now. Green camouflage paint, red rising sun emblems on the wings, canopies glinting in the tropical sun. Chen could see the lead pilot's head moving as he scanned for threats. 20 seconds. Chen armed his guns. For .50 calibers and 120mm cannon, all synchronized to converge at 250 yards. He'd calculated that a 3-second burst would put approximately 60 machine gun rounds and 12 cannon shells into a 20-foot sphere, more than enough to destroy any fighter aircraft ever built. 10 seconds. The leading Zero pilot spotted them and began to turn. Too late. The geometry was already locked in. Chen opened fire at 400 yards. Not a spray-and-pray burst, but a precise 3-second engagement based on calculated deflection angles. The lead Zero flew directly into his bullet stream. Cannon shells stitched across the engine cowling. Machine gun rounds shredded the cockpit. The fighter exploded. Chen didn't pause to watch. He was already calculating his next shot. The second Zero broke hard right, exactly as Chen's tactical analysis predicted. Japanese pilots almost always broke toward the sun when surprised. Chen had pre-calculated the deflection angle for this maneuver. He led the target by exactly 12 degrees, fired a 2-second burst, and watched tracer rounds converge on the Zero's wing route. The aircraft snap-rolled left and went into a vertical dive, streaming smoke. The third Zero tried to head on Chen's Lightning. Brave, but mathematically suicidal. Chen calculated the geometry instantly. Two aircraft approaching each other at a combined closure rate of 700 miles per hour have approximately 0.8 seconds of mutual firing time. The Lightning's concentrated nose-mounted armament gave it an overwhelming advantage in head-on engagements. Chen fired first. Cannon shells punched through the Zero's engine. The Japanese fighter disintegrated. 3 down in the first engagement. Time elapsed, 18 seconds. But Chen wasn't finished calculating. The lower group of Zeros was now climbing toward him, abandoning their attack on the bombers to deal with the threat he represented. For aircraft in a loose line formation, approximately 2,000 feet below and closing fast, Chen rolled inverted and pulled through into a slashing dive. Not to escape, but to control the geometry of the next engagement. He was trading altitude for speed, positioning himself for a high-side attack on the climbing Zeros. Martinez followed, though Chen could hear the confusion in his voice over the radio. "Where are we going, Tom?" "Physics," Chen replied. He leveled out 500 feet above the climbing Zeros and pulled into a hard barrel roll, bleeding speed while maintaining his altitude advantage. The Japanese formation was now directly below him, climbing in line astern, perfect for a sequential attack. Chen rolled out behind the trailing Zero and fired. A 1-second burst at point-blank range. The fighter came apart like a broken toy. The third Zero broke hard left. Chen anticipated this. Japanese doctrine called for immediate evasive maneuvers when attacked from behind. He'd calculated the turn radius for a Zero at current airspeed and G-loading. Instead of following the turn, he pulled up into a climb, then rolled over and came down from above as the Zero completed its evasive maneuver. Another calculated burst. Another kill. The second Zero tried to escape by diving away. Chen let him go for exactly 3 seconds. Then he rolled after him, calculating intercept angles. The Lightning was faster in a dive. Simple physics. He closed the gap, lined up a deflection shot, and fired. The Zero's wing folded upward at an impossible angle. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The lead Zero pilot was experienced. Instead of trying to escape or turn fight, he pulled up into a climbing spiral, forcing Chen to either break off or follow him into a low-energy state, where the Zero's superior maneuverability would become decisive. Chen chose a third option. He calculated the Zero's climb rate and turning radius, then positioned himself for a snapshot as the Japanese fighter crested the top of his spiral. When the Zero pilot rolled over to begin his descent, Chen was waiting with a perfectly calculated deflection shot. 7 down. Time elapsed. 3 minutes, 12 seconds. The remaining 4 Zeros from the original formation were now converging on Chen's position from multiple angles. This was the scenario his mathematical models had been designed to solve: multiple simultaneous threats requiring sequential engagement solutions. Chen climbed to regain altitude, trading speed for position. The Zeros followed, but their climb rate was inferior to the Lightning's at this altitude. Chen had perhaps 15 seconds before they reached firing position. He used those 15 seconds to calculate 4 targets, approaching from different angles at different closure rates. The mathematics required him to determine the optimal sequence for engaging them, which target to hit first, which direction to turn after each shot, how to position himself for successive engagements. The solution was elegant in its simplicity. Instead of trying to engage all 4 simultaneously, he would use their different approach angles to create sequential one-on-one engagements. The key was precise timing and positioning. Chun rolled left toward the nearest zero, firing a calculated burst that forced the Japanese pilot to break off his attack. Not a killing shot, but enough to disrupt his approach. Chun immediately reversed right toward the second zero, which was committed to a high-side attack and couldn't evade quickly enough. Another calculated burst. The zero's canopy disappeared in a shower of aluminum fragments. 8 down. The third zero fired at long range, tracers arcing wide of Chun's lightning. Chun ignored the shooting and maintained his heading until the last possible second, then pulled hard into a climbing turn that brought him around behind the zero as it flashed past. A 2-second burst at 200 yards range. The fighter exploded. 9 down. The fourth zero pilot was either very brave or very desperate. He continued his attack even as Chun's lightning came around to meet him head-on. They fired simultaneously at a combined closure rate of 650 miles per hour. The Zero's bullets sparked off the Lightning's armored windscreen. Chun's cannon shells found the Zero's engine. Both aircraft passed within 50 feet of each other. Chun looked back to see the Zero rolling slowly to the right, smoke pouring from its cowling, before it nosed over into a terminal dive. 10 down. The final engagement involved the two Kawasaki Ki-61 Tony fighters, which had been holding high cover while the Zeros attacked. These pilots were experienced. They waited until Chun was committed to his attack sequence, then rolled in from opposite directions in a coordinated assault. Chun found himself in exactly the scenario his mathematics had prepared him for. Multiple threats converging from calculated angles at predicted closure rates. He didn't panic. He calculated. The Tonys were heavier and faster than Zeros, but less maneuverable. Their attack angles suggested they were trying to bracket him, force him to choose between two equally lethal threats. Chun chose neither. Instead, he pulled up into a steep climb, trading speed for altitude, forcing both Tonys to adjust their attack angles. The geometry changed. Instead of a coordinated attack from two directions, Chun now faced sequential threats from predictable vectors. He rolled over the top of his climb and came down on the first Tony from above and behind, a perfect deflection shot at 300 yards range. 11 down. The final Tony pilot broke off and ran for home. Total time elapsed, 3 minutes, 57 seconds. Chun had just shot down 11 Japanese fighters in under 4 minutes using nothing but mathematics, physics, and the kind of precise calculation his squadron mates had mocked as useless scribbling. When Chun landed at Henderson Field, his Lightning was almost undamaged. A few bullet holes in the wing, a cracked piece of plexiglass, nothing serious. His ground crew chief, Sergeant Kowalski, stared at the aircraft in amazement. "What happened up there, Lieutenant?" "Applied mathematics," Chun replied. The debriefing was surreal. The intelligence officer listened as Chun described the engagement in methodical detail. 11 enemy fighters engaged and destroyed in sequential order based on calculated firing solutions. No damage to friendly aircraft. No ammunition wasted. Each kill described in terms of deflection angles, closure rates, and ballistic trajectories. Major Nichols asked if anyone could corroborate the story. Martinez confirmed Chun's account, though he admitted he'd mostly followed along without understanding the tactical logic. Wade and Torres had been engaged with other enemy formations and hadn't witnessed Chun's engagement directly. But the gun camera footage didn't lie. 11 aircraft destroyed in precise sequence. Each engagement lasting only seconds. Each shot calculated and deliberate. Word spread through the 475th Fighter Group like wildfire. The quiet math nerd with the thick glasses and notebook full of equations had just achieved what no American fighter pilot had ever done. Destroyed 11 enemy aircraft in a single engagement without taking meaningful damage. Other pilots started asking questions. How did he calculate deflection angles so quickly? How did he predict enemy maneuvers? Could he teach them his methods? Chun agreed to share his knowledge. He spent evenings in the ready room, explaining ballistics and geometry to anyone willing to listen. He drew diagrams on blackboards, showed firing solution tables, demonstrated how to calculate deflection angles mentally. Some pilots embraced the mathematical approach. Others remained skeptical. They'd been trained to trust instinct over equations. But the results spoke for themselves. Pilots who applied Chun's methods started achieving higher hit rates with less ammunition expenditure. Squadron kill ratios improved. Loss rates decreased. The mathematical approach to aerial combat began spreading through the 5th Air Force. Fighter groups started incorporating deflection calculation training into their briefings. Gun camera footage was analyzed more systematically, looking for patterns Chun had identified. Chun himself continued flying combat missions. He scored additional kills using the same methodical approach, never more than 1 or 2 per mission, but with remarkable consistency and minimal ammunition expenditure. By the end of his tour, he had 17 confirmed victories, making him one of the Pacific Theater's top aces. More importantly, his mathematical methods were credited with saving dozens of American lives. Pilots who learned his deflection calculation techniques survived longer and achieved more consistent combat success. The war ended. Chun returned to California and used the GI Bill to complete his engineering degree at Berkeley. He graduated in 1947 with highest honors, then joined Lockheed as a flight test engineer. He spent 30 years there, analyzing aircraft performance, writing technical manuals, training younger engineers. He never became famous. His name rarely appeared in aviation histories. He didn't write memoirs or give interviews. When people asked about his war service, he'd mention that he'd flown fighters in the Pacific, then changed the subject to engineering topics. But his mathematical approach to aerial combat became foundational to fighter tactics. The Navy adopted his deflection calculation methods. The newly formed Air Force incorporated them into pilot training. By the Korean War, every American fighter pilot learned the principles Chun had developed over the Solomon Islands. The Navy Fighter Weapons School, later known as Top Gun, built much of its air-to-air curriculum around mathematical approaches to combat maneuvering. The weapons school's instructors studied Chun's gun camera footage and after-action reports, extracting lessons about geometric thinking and calculated aggression. Modern fighter pilots learned to think like Chun thought, treating air combat as a series of mathematical problems to be solved in real time. Radar systems and computer-assisted firing solutions have automated many of his calculations, but the underlying principles remain unchanged. Physics doesn't negotiate. Geometry doesn't panic. Mathematics applied correctly under stress can be more deadly than raw courage or natural instinct. Thomas Chun died in 1994 at the age of 75. His obituary in the San Francisco Chronicle mentioned that he was a veteran and a retired aerospace engineer. It didn't mention the 11 zeros. It didn't mention the notebook. It didn't mention that he'd revolutionized how fighter pilots think about aerial combat. But at Edwards Air Force Base, where the Air Force tests experimental aircraft, there's a conference room named after him, the Thomas Y. Chun Flight Test Analysis Center. It's where test pilots and engineers gather to solve problems that have never been solved before, using mathematics and physics to push the boundaries of what's possible. There's a plaque on the wall that reads, "Precision in thought leads to precision in action." Those weren't Chun's words, but they captured his philosophy perfectly. Inside the conference room, young test pilots learned the same lesson Chun proved over the Solomon Islands in 1943. Sometimes the most sophisticated weapon in a cockpit isn't a machine gun or a missile. Sometimes it's a mind trained to think clearly under pressure, to calculate when others react, to trust mathematics even when physics seems impossible. Chun never mocked the instinct pilots. He never claimed superiority over those who flew by feel. He simply offered an alternative approach, one that required patience, humility, and a willingness to be ridiculed by people who didn't yet understand. He absorbed their mockery. He ignored their skepticism. And when 11 Japanese fighters filled his gun sight and no help was coming, he proved that mathematics wasn't the opposite of courage. It was courage's most reliable ally. The sky doesn't care about bravado. It doesn't respect tradition. It only responds to physics. And physics, if you understand it deeply enough, can turn a quiet engineering student into the most lethal fighter pilot in the Pacific Theater. Thomas Chun understood this. He calculated his way through chaos, thought his way through violence, and proved that sometimes the best reaction to overwhelming odds isn't to react at all. Sometimes the best response is to do the math. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.